welcome to week 3 of the Portal Quilt Sewalong. I'm glad that you're here. We're in week 3 of this quilt construction, and if you missed the videos for weeks 1 and 2, they are always available on my YouTube channel, and as well you can find links to everything on my website. If you're on the mailing list, you get an email every Monday morning when a new video is posted. So week 3, we are sewing our blocks. So we have gathered and sorted our fabrics for week 1. Week 2, we cut and we organized. Week 3, we're sewing the actual large blocks. Week 4, next week, we'll be talking about applying the centers. Week 5 will be laying out and piecing the entire quilt top. Week 6, we will be sandwiching the layers and talking about quilting options. Week 7, we're going to be squaring up the edges and binding the quilt. So I'm taking you through all the steps, and we're doing it nice and slow so that you don't feel rushed. It's meant to go at your own pace. You're not in trouble if you're jumping ahead. As a matter of fact, if you feel that creative urge to jump ahead, please go ahead and jump ahead. If you feel that you're behind, I'm here to tell you that you're not behind ever. This is a work at your own pace and learn a couple things while you make a quilt. So I'm glad that you're here. So let's talk about keeping everything organized. So as you may have caught on from last week's video when we were cutting, I really like keeping my space organized. I am a messy creative at heart, and usually when I'm making a project that involves messes, and I've learned to embrace that. Those of you that have been following me for a long time may remember that I worked with a gold certified KonMari consultant last year, the beginning of 2019, to sort of help me organize my studio. My business has grown. I have a lot of things and bits and fabric in here that I need to keep track of. And what I realized in working with her is that there are some tricks that I can do to keep myself organized. Also, I am very messy when I am in the middle of a project, and that is completely okay. So she sort of gave me permission to embrace the chaos when I'm working. Apparently that's when I feel energized creatively. But in between projects, I like to sort of bring everything back to a tidier level to start over fresh. And I actually talked about that this week in my Quilting and Answer video on ways to sort of refine your creative spark. So I have an IKEA flat file. This is a piece of furniture that my husband used to use when he was consulting from home. He needed to keep artwork and tear sheets and things like that in a flat file. And when he no longer worked out of the house and he had this piece of furniture, he gave it to me to actually help hold up the center of my long sewing table in my studio. So I don't think I've ever actually shown it, but it's got like stacks of Nancy Drew and Hardy Boys books between the top of the flat file and my sewing table, and it's literally helping to keep the center of the table from sagging. It was empty for years. I didn't know how to use it, but my KonMari specialist gave me some ideas. And so now I was going to show you. So I went to the dollar store one day and I cleaned them out of sheets of foam core, and foam core has become my new favorite thing to organize with. This is a sheet of foam core that is cut to fit the inside dimensions of the flat file drawers. And I'll link to the type of flat file that it is. But what I do now is I cut the pieces for something like this, which we did last week, And when I'm done, rather than just stack all these up and move them over to the side where my cat can sit on them or they could get knocked over, I put them on a sheet of foam core with the pattern. I took the pattern out for the video, but in this case I would put the pattern in the on the foam core sheet, and I take this whole thing and I put it back in my flat file drawer. There's no danger of me forgetting that it's there. But what happens is when I take it out, it hasn't gotten coffee spilled on it, the cat hasn't been laying on it, and it's organized from where I left it, and I can just start diving into constructing the blocks. So let's talk about the blocks. And I'm going to get the original quilt. This week, we're going to construct these big blocks. The centers come next week. This is just constructing this block. And what I want you to pay attention to on the original quilt on the cover, which is also right here, is that the two side pieces, the two side triangles, are always a darker value than the top and the bottom ones. Now the top and the bottom are the same in each block, and the two sides are the same. You could certainly mix them up, but I think visually that would be a lot. So I think it's better if the top and the bottom are the same fabric and the two sides are the same fabric. But as you construct these blocks, the way that you're going to get the sort of optical illusion of looking inward at a portal is when the fabric that you use for the two sides is always a darker value than the fabric that you use for the top and bottom. You're concentrating this week on just making each individual block and checking that your values are the way that they should be in each individual block, not the way that the blocks look to each other. So in other words, I'm looking just at how the value of this and this read together. I'm not looking at how the value of these fabrics look with this block here. And that's why I'm not asking you to sew all of the blocks to each other this week. I still want to work on them as individual components. My biggest piece of advice for this week is to not overthink this design. I have taught value quilting for a long time now in many workshops, and I can tell you that overthinking and sweating like tiny details never yields a better quilt. Let your creative instinct guide you. Don't second guess yourself. Of course, there will be times when you need to second guess yourself, but not every time and not as often as you think. We're going to construct these blocks, and we're going to make sure that in each individual block that you've got two sides, which eventually will be the top and the bottom of the block, that fabric is always going to be lighter than this fabric on the sides. These two particular fabrics are kind of a dark value, but these two triangles are definitely lighter in value than these two sides, and that's all that matters at this stage. So the way that I kind of lay these out, you can see here on the foam core here, I've got my centers. I've got all the centers that I need out of the three fabrics for my throw size quilt, which I think you need 30. And I've got my light values and my dark values. So what I'll do is set this up so that I can just sew one right after the other. And that's another way that I trick myself into not overthinking this process. So let's just start and lay out what it's going to look like. So here is one fabric times two triangles pulled from my light value. And now I'm going to pull two from my medium value stack. So, and also one thing that I do is This is when you're going to be using your ruby ruler a lot. And I actually have my ruby minder here, my thread minder, but it's the same idea. And I don't know if I can show you that in the screen. Let's see. But I'm looking through it just enough to check and make sure that I've got good contrast. And it doesn't have to be a lot of contrast. That's the other thing. This is not exactly a strong contrast, but when I look through my value lens, my ruby ruler or ruby minder, I see that this is a darker value than this. That works for that square. That's square number 1. Then directly over that, I'm going to just lay out another square. So those are from my light value, and this is from my medium value stack. Now, I think you can probably see without having to look through the ruby ruler that we've got good contrast here, and these are definitely, this fabric's definitely a darker value than this fabric, so that one is kind of a no-brainer. To make this size quilt like you see on the cover, I would go ahead and use all of these to lay out 30 blocks without like thinking too hard, because your goal here, A, is to be organized, and B, is to pick up each block and sew it and press it and be able to watch Netflix at the same time. All right, so let's sew one of these blocks together. So I've got my block laid out here, and what I'm going to do is first sew this side together, and I just line up the edge that I'm going to sew. It's really important to lay each one out before you start sewing it so that you do not get confused about which side to sew. So I'm just going to sew this side, these two together. I don't normally pin, but you could certainly pin if you're more comfortable doing that. I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. No need to backstitch, and put that one back in place. And now I'm going to sew this side together. Again, I'm just going to line it up. So now we have the two sides sewn together. So now we're going to sew them to each other. I always press the seam allowances to the darker side, so I'm going to do that now. So by pressing the seam allowances to the darker side, or the medium value fabric, these are going to nest here in the center really nicely. And so hopefully you can see this seam allowance pressed to this dark brown, this seam allowance pressed to this darker brown, and they're going to line up, but you want to make sure that opposite fabrics are touching each other. Again, I don't pin, but you can absolutely pin. And then you're just going to sew this particular seam, same as the others. You can kind of put your finger in there and feel that those two seam allowances are sort of nesting against each other. And the main thing to make sure of when you're sewing this center seam here is that you don't want to tug at it as you're sewing. Sometimes we have a tendency when we want to line something up under the presser fit, we have a tendency to want to tug at it, and you don't want to do that. You want to let the feed dogs do their job and guide it through, because remember, these inside seams are bias edges. So tugging at them could make the top fabric feed through differently than the bottom fabric, and you might get some bowing or some weird, your fabric could start doing some weird things. So that is a finished block, and the darker of the two values on the side and the lighter on the top and the bottom. So I usually just keep laying them out the way that they will be laid out in the quilt when I stack them up, but there you go. You've sewn your blocks, you've pressed them, and you've got them all in a stack, and now you're ready to square them up. When I square up, I like to use a square ruler. This one I have is a 15-inch square. It'd be great if you could have at least a 10 or a 12-inch square to square these up. It makes it so much easier. The goal is that you want these to be trimmed down to 9 inches square, and you want this little area to fall in the center. So to do that, I'm going to shave a little bit off of each side. So if I need the block to be 9 by 9, then I know that the center point needs to be 4.5 inches. So as I'm laying this ruler over my square, I'm looking at where this 4.5 inch mark goes through, kind of making sure it's in the center. And when it's in the center, it's going to expose the uneven edges on this side. So I'm going to go ahead and trim those off. And then I'm going to spin it around. And this time I'm also still looking at the 4.5 inch mark going through the center. But this time I'm also looking at where this 9 inch line here and the 9 inch line here are lining up. You want these to line up with the edge of the two sides that you've already trimmed. So I've got my 9 inch sides lined up with the lines, the 9 inch lines on the ruler. I also have the 4.5 inch lines going through the center. I'm also looking at where this diagonal line on the ruler, I want that always to go over the seam line. So now I'm going to make my final cut to trim off these two edges. And there is my finished block. So now it's ready to be sewn into the quilt. My seam allowances, you could spin these center seams if you wanted to. If you're interested in learning what that term means, I have a video and I'll link to it here. It just reduces a little bit of the bulk, but I'm not that worried about the bulk in the center. It's going to be covered up with the center blocks. So now we're just going to square each of these. So have subtle color value differences and some that have more contrasty color value differences. Both of these types of blocks are important for a quilt like this. So I hope that makes sense. Please leave comments with any questions. Share your progress online. I love to see everybody's cut pieces, quilt blocks, how it's going in construction, and I believe that the best hashtag to use is the hashtag that's on the back of the pattern, WiseCraftPortal. And tag me on Instagram, Blair S. I'd love to see what you're doing. So stay safe, everyone. Stay home, make something pretty, and I will see you next week.